Hello, this is Dr. Ruby, and welcome to the lecture for Module 14, the gait cycle. Here are the objectives for this module. The gait cycle is defined as the cyclic pattern of engagement of muscles and joints of the body when walking. As seen in this illustration, the gait cycle begins with one heel strike and ends with the same side heel strike. One gait cycle is comprised of one stride, which in turn is comprised of two steps. Heel strike is the landmark that begins stance phase and ends swing phase. Foot flat is the moment that the entire plantar surface of the foot comes into contact with the ground. Mid-stance is the midpoint of stance phase and occurs when the weight of the body is directly over the lower extremity. Heel off is defined as the moment that the heel leaves the ground. Toe off is defined as the moment that the person's toes push off and leave the ground. Toe off is the landmark that ends the stance phase and begins the swing phase. Swing phase is divided into 3 equal sections and accounts for 40% of the gait cycle. The stance phase is defined as when the foot is on the ground and accounts for 60% of the gait cycle for each foot. The swing phase is defined as when the foot is swinging in the air. The period of double limb support is when both feet are in contact with the ground, and walking is defined by the presence of double limb support. Take a close look at this illustration. All of the major landmarks of stance phase and swing phase are illustrated here in this figure. The foot must be supple and flexible to adapt to the uneven surfaces of the ground. It must be stiff and stable to propel the body forward during toeing off. Supination holds the arches high and creates a more rigid, stable foot for propulsion. But the ability of the plantar fascia to change from being lax to taut is created by the windlass mechanism. There are 3 major roles of the musculature of the lower extremity during the gait cycle. Muscles may contract concentrically to create movement of the lower extremity. Muscles may contract eccentrically to slow down a movement of the lower extremity, and muscles may contract isometrically to stabilize a body part. Improper mechanics during the gait cycle often leads to functional problems throughout the body. This figure shows the intensity of the contractions of the major muscles of the lower extremity correlated with the phases and landmarks of the gait cycle. The hip joint flexors contract concentrically to create the forward swing of the lower extremity during the early aspect of the swing phase, and contract eccentrically to decelerate the extension of the thigh just before toeing off in the stance phase. The hip joint extensors contract eccentrically to decelerate the forward swinging of the limb in the late aspect of the swing phase, and contract isometrically on heel strike of the stance phase to stabilize the pelvis. The hip joint abductors contract, creating a force of depression on the same side of the pelvis during the stance phase of gait. The hip joint adductors contract at heel strike to aid the hip joint's extensor stabilization of the hip joint. They contract again just after toe off to aid in flexion of the thigh at the hip joint. The medial rotator muscles are active during the stance phase of gait, performing their reverse action of ipsilateral rotation of the pelvis at the hip joint. The hip joint lateral rotators are primarily active during the stance phase of gait. They control the hip joint medial rotator's action on the pelvis. The reverse action of the lateral rotator muscles of the hip joint is contralateral rotation of the pelvis at the hip joint. Contralateral rotation of the pelvis is extremely important when planting and cutting in sports. Planting and cutting is done when a person plants a foot on the ground and then changes the direction that he or she is running by turning the body to orient to the opposite side. The knee joint extensor muscles have an important role during the gait cycle. They contract concentrically at the end of the swing phase to extend the leg at the knee joint and reach out with the leg in preparation for heel strike. Knee joint extensors also contract during stance phase to decelerate the knee and create extension of the knee joint. The knee joint flexors contract eccentrically to decelerate the knee joint extension just before heel strike, and they contract just after heel strike to stabilize the knee and contract during the swing phase to keep the foot from dragging on the ground. The ankle joint dorsiflexors eccentrically contract to decelerate plantar flexion of the foot at the ankle joint and at the beginning of the stance phase. They also contract concentrically during the swing phase of the gait cycle to create dorsiflexion of the foot at the ankle joint to keep the toes from scraping the ground as the sweeping limb is brought forward. The ankle joint plantar flexors eccentrically contract during most of the stance phase to decelerate dorsiflexion of the foot at the ankle joint. They also contract more forcibly in a concentric manner at heel off during the late stage of the stance phase to help push the foot off the floor. Subtalar joint supinators contract eccentrically during the stance phase to decelerate pronation of the foot at the subtalar joint. They also concentrically contract between foot flat and toe off to supinate the foot at the subtalar joint. The subtalar joint pronators are active during the later stance phase of the gait cycle. They contract along with the subtalar joint supinators to help stabilize the foot and make it more rigid as it readies itself to push off the ground for propulsion.